And we are live. All right. Hey there, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us again. If you guys haven't been here before, my name is Ben Rojan, aka the Seattle Data Guy. Today we're going to be talking to Ethan Aaron of Portable. How are you doing, Ethan?
I'm doing great. Awesome to catch up as always. Excited for the conversation.
Yeah, it's always good to catch up. So I mean, this is just more offshoot, weird question. So, we had someone bring up the fact that we both have a Romanian connection. Why don't I know how we both have a Romanian connection?
We actually probably should have talked about this. So in middle school and high school, I actually wrote my college essay on this. I used to compete internationally with model airplanes.
Okay.
And so I was building these model airplanes that are balsa wood airplanes powered by rubber bands. And I went to the world championships for model airplane building in Slanik Prahova, Romania, which there is a massive salt mine underground, and it's been donated by the country to like the Model Airplane Society. So it's just used for flying model airplanes. So I've been to Romania. I went there sophomore year of high school for the World Championships of Model Airplanes.
Nice. All right. Well, there you go. I was just like, what is the connection here? I didn't know there was a connection. That is a very specific connection. Cool. Well, I guess we know what you do outside of the world of data. You build model airplanes. Actually, you do a lot of things. Whenever we talk, you're doing lots of other things. I'm like, how do you have time to be CEO plus some other things that you're always doing? But yeah, like I think starting this conversation, like, how did you get into data? Like, because you, I think, had a little less of everyone has a less traditional path. But what was your less traditional path?
So I actually started my career in investing. I was like, I want to go work in investment banking. Ended up taking a job right out of college doing real estate private equity at Goldman Sachs. So we were buying properties, buying physical office buildings, multifamily properties, et cetera. And I was on the acquisitions team. So I was building models, valuing properties. And I found myself gravitating less so towards the acquisitions part of this, the actual I'm going to go buy this property, look at this property, transact, and more towards, hey, if we restructured our process or we fixed our model to put all the inputs here, all the transformations here, all the outputs here, like we could scale and do this 10% more efficiently, 20% more efficiently. So I found myself liking the operational side more so than the transaction side. And then a couple of years in, I was like, I think I need to just go to a startup. So I went to a startup company called Arbor Technologies. And it was a 12-person company in the data world, and they needed someone to do sales. I joined this company, and day one, the CEO was like, hey, do you know SQL? Do you know shell script? Can you code? I was like, no, but I'll figure it out. So I bought 2, maybe 3 books on SQL, bunch of other random books on like Go and GitHub and whatever. And I just started banging my head against our read replica in Postgres. And I was just building dashboards to try and understand like the key metrics for the business. And I was just doing it for the CEO. That was it. So that's how I got started. Then I did product for a little while. And then we got acquired by LiveRamp. And I looked around, I was like, LiveRamp's a 1,000-person company. Why don't we have a data team? And I just wrote the job description and became the head of BI at LiveRamp. And that's kind of how I learned a lot about all the tools in the data world, how to actually engage with executives at big companies around business value and management and the other stuff. So, and then started Portable 3.5 years ago in this world, but I'm also the data person. So I've been writing SQL queries for years now.
Yeah, it's almost funny that you say like LiveRamp didn't have a data team, because I feel like LiveRamp is data, right? Like isn't that what they're selling? It's kind of like a different version of Nielsen or something.
It's very interesting. So it kind of segues well into structuring data teams.
Yeah.
They didn't have a centralized data team. So and I assumed, and everyone else assumed, that meant there was no data team. So wrote the job description. People were like, oh yeah, we don't have, at the time there were 3 jobs that got created: COO, head of BizOps, and head of BI. I was the head of BI. Someone else was head of BizOps. Someone else was COO. None of those existed until one day. But when it came to the actual BI, so I stood up our BI team. I used the word BI just because I didn't know all the different terms. And I also just still don't care which term. Like I was the data person, the analytics guy. But did this and then realized marketing had spent a ton of money on slalom consultants to stand up a data stack, had their own Redshift plus Tableau plus Matillion that data stack. Product had a different Redshift environment with Looker. we had come in with Postgres and Chartio. Other people were using Data Studio. So it was like, it was just decentralized at that point. So what I was doing was creating a centralized function, collapsing everything down. And then it's just one of the many patterns you see when it comes to structuring data teams. Like we were decentralized, never had a centralized platform team. That's what I was standing up at Library.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very common path for some companies, is like either because there is a centralized data team that has limited capacity or whatever, has too much bureaucracy, so people just build their own thing, right? Like they just hire Slalom, or I've been on plenty of those projects where it's like, you know what, you'll just build the thing, and because we're not getting answers right fast enough. Is that something you see a lot in companies?
Yes. So like there's a bunch of different patterns you see. There's like everything's decentralized, or like a team has built like their marketing data stack, and then other teams want access, so they start spinning stuff up. But I think to your point, it's like the data team is centralized, but they're really, really slow, is something I hear about all the time. And I hear about it both from like business stakeholders, and I hear about it from data teams. The data teams are like, how are we supposed to engage with all these business stakeholders when we have a 2-week long like QA process for every single thing we deliver? It's like, well, it seems like you need to split, like in a lot of respects, like you have to split that. You have to have a fast cycle approach and you have to have a slow cycle approach. Otherwise, those other teams are going to do it on their own, and they're going to have their own fast cycle approach. So it's like, I think it's like it's all people. All of this is people. It's like, are people being served with data or not? Because if they're not, they're going to ignore whatever team structure you have in place, and they're going to put their own in. So I think understanding those dynamics is absolutely critical for anyone in data or anyone thinking about working with their own internal data teams.
Yeah. In terms of like fast cycle, slow cycle, like what do you kind of envision when you say that? Like what is behind those terms?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to some of my arguments in the data contract world of like, data contracts don't make sense in a lot of scenarios, but they do make sense in some scenarios. I think most of the dialogues around this come in, it's either data contracts are amazing, you should always use them, or me being like, data contracts kill innovation, which effectively implies never use them. I think the reality is, and the job of most data teams is, you have to draw the line somewhere. You have to draw the line where something becomes production grade, like external clients are using it, it's powering your financial reporting, it's going to investors or regulators. So like, you have to understand the things that are absolutely critical and need to have 2-week long QA processes, like CI/CD, data contracts, all these things, like, because you have to have them. Like, that makes complete sense. But if you apply that mentality to, oh, the random marketing analyst needs to understand this thing for their campaign tomorrow, you're never going to get them their answers fast enough. So they're going to go spin up their own data stack and spin up their own shadow data function. So what you effectively, in my opinion, centralized data teams either need to give the teams their own resources to do the fast cycle work, or they need to be able to very rapidly triage between, is this a production grade workflow that everyone knows has to be perfect? And if so, put it through the 2-week long process. Or is it a fast cycle thing that we can just get people answers quickly? I think most people pick one of two, and then the data's garbage and you're reporting it to the SEC and you have a problem. Or everything's production grade and your data team's dysfunctional because you're not shipping anything. But the two things you shipped are high quality. So it's like, I think most teams don't realize there's two different types of work that come through the door. And if you can triage those, I think that's step one for most data teams.
Just because you mentioned it, have you had experiences where you've seen people report data to the SEC that was inaccurate?
So I think my favorite, so reporting to the SEC is one thing, but it's like accounting and finance data. I have pretty strong opinions on this. I think what a lot of people don't realize in data is they think about all projects the same. They're like, oh, look at all these data projects. We're going to put them all through the same pipeline. And there's reporting that can change, like that when you report publicly, like, and to regulators, like, it has to be accurate and you can't fundamentally change the underlying SQL query. But it's also just like the basics of like things like accounting have to be perfect. Yeah. Like they have to actually add up. And there was a Reddit thread, which is like the best example of this, in my opinion, where it was data people getting really upset because they had signed up to take on this very, very large accounting project for the company. And leadership came back and was like, what are you doing here? This is wrong. Like, this is a huge waste of our money and time. And the data teams being like, but we're almost there. not realizing like almost there is not an acceptable answer in the accounting world. So I think being able to draw that line and very clearly put projects in one of the two boxes is absolutely critical. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you mean. There's like there's a bunch of like classic stories. If you Google like 12 worst Excel mistakes that have ever occurred, where yeah, I mean like maybe you're not thinking your modern data stack, but like Excel to a degree can become chaos very quickly.
Yeah.
You worked in finance, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so it's like these million, if not in some cases, $1 billion mistakes that have occurred because, you know, your formula is wrong. And then you report that. I think there was like one, I don't remember which company it was, like they reported it to the SEC and then like for 3 quarters they were wrong and they didn't realize it. And then they had to like rerun all of their reporting. So it's those are serious things. Does that mean that there's certain work that data teams shouldn't take on and should just say no to?
I think so. I would argue for most data teams, if you don't know anything about accounting, you're not going to understand all the stuff that actually has to go into a QA process for that type of data, and you're going to drastically underestimate how much work that actually takes. So like, I would put it into this needs to be production grade column, and then I would put it into another column, which is it has to be production grade, and I don't even understand what that means. So like, if that's the case and you don't understand what you're doing, I probably wouldn't take it on just from the sheer amount of work it's going to take you to get up to speed on adding value. So most teams, I would say stay away from anything related to accounting. There's like planning things in the finance world that I would say are more like acceptable as long as they're not being used for like public reporting. Other than that, I think in most scenarios, it comes down to just like being able to back of the envelope understand how big of a project is this. And I think people mess that up in the accounting world pretty quickly. I think other than that, it's your job to be able to say, can this be ad hoc? Can it be production grade, or does it have to be perfect? And just knowing that up front, because I think a lot of data teams make mistakes finding that out after they've gotten 2/3 of the way through the project, and they don't realize how much time they've wasted, or how big of an iceberg it is that they're trying to get through.
Yeah. Do you have a post on that somewhere where it's like breaking down those 3 categories: ad hoc, production?
I actually don't know if I did. Yeah, good idea.
Surprised.
We should write something.
Yeah, because you tend to like, I think those kind of three piece breakdowns. So I guess in team structure, would you say, like, again, you kind of experience building a data kind of core functionality at LiveRamp. Did you? So it sounds like you centralized it first. Is that kind of the initial step you did? Like everyone was doing their own thing, so you actually went maybe the opposite way that most companies envision it, is like you centralized it first. Is that kind of how you describe it?
For me, I became the head of data overnight, right?
Yeah.
Wrote the job description, became the head of data. But when you do that at any company, unless you're a startup where you are like at Portable, we were a 2-person company and I was also the head of data. So like that's like the true inception of a data team. It's just I started building dashboards and there were 2 of us. But so like that's how early you can get. Any other moment in time in the history of a company, like you're coming into something that resembles data. Like someone either decided not to have a data team, is using spreadsheets, is using PowerPoint, something else exists. So like I became the head of data, centralized data at LiveRamp. And what I really focused on was like, there were a lot of problems in terms of what was happening. Number one, no one was actually accountable to all the executives. No one was going to the CEO saying, hey, what matters to you? What are the top priorities for the business? Let's globally prioritize this. So like that was number one for me. It was like, figure out that answer. Number 2, figure out the resources that actually exist across the company. What I started to realize was the marketing department had really great access to our marketing and sales systems. Product had really great access to our product database and product systems. I had access to the company we'd been acquired and all their systems, but none of those data people had access to the other stuff. So like marketing was complaining, trying to get access to the product data. Like I was trying to get access to Salesforce, product was trying to get access to Salesforce. Like, so what I started to realize was you have decentralized people doing great things for their own execs. The problem was they were all blocked on infrastructure. They were all blocked because they were all trying to get access, and LiveRamp's like deals with a lot of sensitive data. It's like takes security and privacy extremely seriously. So getting access to those systems takes a while. So I think what I was coming into was there's no centralized team that could actually be accountable to the entire exec team. And number two, infrastructure, the ability to ingest data, transform data, visualize data in a standardized way was a blocker. So the way I approached it was get everyone in a room, figure out the architecture we would want to actually address the problems, understand what everyone's doing, because if any of those 3, 4, 5 people quit, their entire data stack's going to go, it's just going to disappear overnight. And globally prioritize across the executives. So like that's how I started standing things up. We didn't actually pull the analysts out of their teams. They were still in marketing, they were still in product, et cetera. Over time, that actually did change. Some of the other resources did come into the centralized team. But keeping them in their own team, we were just giving them leverage. We were giving them more information on global priorities, and we were giving them centralized technology so they didn't have to think about getting access. But they could still go build stuff for the CMO, which was awesome. Because then the CMO had all of their needs met, and it was amazing, as opposed to what I think a lot of centralized teams do, which is they start off centralized with, they centralize everyone, and then they globally prioritize, and you end up globally prioritizing for one exec, and everyone else you say no to, and then they build their own shadow data stacks, and then you have to figure out how to manage that type of stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So I'd say like you prefer kind of the default being maybe there's a central data team that is used, like maybe you mostly manage data infra or you kind of centralize data, but you still have kind of analysts, maybe decentralized. Is that kind of your default vision?
I think it depends on the company size. I think super small companies, you need someone who's just accountable to the CEO. It could be, ideally, it is the CEO just building their own dashboards. If that's not the case, you have someone else whose part-time job is building insights for the CEO, because at that size company, the CEO has a pretty good understanding of what's important to everyone, and everyone can see the dashboards. You're good to go. As companies grow, most companies start with a centralized data team of anywhere from, like, they start with one, goes to like maybe 2, maybe 3 people. You have like a head of data, someone focused on more of the hardcore data engineering stuff, like maybe it's a data engineer title, and then someone focused entirely on just analyst work, building dashboards for the entire company. So like that's typical what I'll see for smaller companies that not super small, because you're investing in a serious data team. You either have 1 data person or 3. And then as things grow, I either see teams kind of split that and try and become like we have 4 analysts, 4 data engineers, and a data scientist. Or what you see, which I actually tend to prefer in those scenarios, is a centralized platform team with decentralized analysts. Whether or not the decentralized analysts report into the data person or report into the business functions, I think is secondary. I think they have to have a dotted line into both. Like they have to report to both effectively, but they have to be talking to the business stakeholders, and they have to be doing it all the time. And they have to be globally they have to be prioritizing for the business, not prioritizing for the data people, because the data people aren't the business people in 99% of companies.
What do you think happens when they prioritize for the data people?
You just buy tools for the sake of buying tools, and then you're like, oh shoot, like what is the point of our team? And then someone comes along and they're like, hey, what's this 20-person team doing over here? And they're like, oh, look at all the cool technology and the models that we have. And a lot of those teams right now are being downsized. And it's one of those things where like you learn a lot about technology, but what I think it's like running a startup with 20 engineers and no go-to-market people. If no one's paying your bills, that's not sustainable. Like you have to have some balance of the people building, and then you have some understanding of what are people willing to pay for. And I think it's the exact same with data teams. Like you have to have an understanding of what a CMO will raise their hand and say, that's really valuable. Like I will take budget from my account and give it to the data team, because this is more valuable than me trying to do it myself. I think if all you do is R&D and you never think about who's paying your bills, you'll end up in a bad spot. And most companies shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I've definitely seen it happen. So that's why I'm always curious to ask, like, what happens when you're not, reporting to the business people? Do you think, I mean, are there like caveats though, working with the business that you'd also kind of give to data people, data teams in general, especially if they're like even more integrated?
What do you mean by that?
Oh, I don't know. Is there anything that like, maybe a business person, when you're so attached, like starts dreaming up things that are maybe not feasible or maybe don't make sense, but you want to, because maybe you are accountable to them, it's harder to say no to?
I would say, like, for most data teams, you kind of have to pick a specialty, or you have to get really big, and then you can try and do all three, but it's still really complicated. You either are an analytics team, which means you build dashboards to inform decision making. If that's the case, if someone comes along and they're like, hey, can you reverse ETL this data and automate these workflows? I personally would say no. I would say, sorry, that's not in scope. My job is build dashboards. That is it. So either become an analytics team focused on analytics. Option two, you're an automation team. And the goal there is automate workflows across your business. In that case, like, your modern data stack could help, or your data stack could help, or you're ingesting, transforming, and delivering data through reverse ETL. You should also probably be using something like Zapier or Workato or Trade.io or UiPath to point-to-point integrate systems, or Segment in the real-time world. But like, if that's your team's mission, like your team's mission is just automate tasks across the company, like, it's a cost-cutting game. Like, the whole thing is just give leverage to people, save time, and those are the types of projects you should be seeking out and taking on. The problem is, and then the third one is, you are a product team. Like, companies that want to use data to build embedded dashboards inside of their product that they generate revenue from. In that third bucket, you're tasked with generating revenue. I think what a lot of companies, a lot of data teams mess up by trying to blur those lines. They're like, oh, I'm going to build the data. I'm going to build the dashboards. Then I'm going to expose them externally because that sounds cool. And I'm going to reverse ETL some data into HubSpot. And it becomes unmeasurable immediately, because now you're trying to compare apples to oranges. It's like, how valuable is this dashboard relative to saving ourselves 10 hours a week in automation, relative to revenue from external clients? Like, those are three fundamentally different things to prioritize across. In most scenarios, like early companies, like, you can sometimes they get all bundled in one person. In a lot of respects, I would pick one of the three, say no to the other ones, or carve them out distinctly as different responsibilities and prioritize them independently from each other.
Yeah. So are you saying like the team shouldn't take on all three, or like an individual shouldn't take on all three?
I would say I would start at the team level. Like, pick your mission, like pick the point of your team. So, slight tangent. I posted on LinkedIn a couple of times recently in the last couple of months. Why should your company have a data team? Like, what is the point? Like, why? Like, if your CEO comes to you, or if anyone comes to you, if your parents, like, someone comes to you and like, why does your team exist? Like, what is your answer? All of the answers are bad, including my own. Like, so it's one of those things where I think having as clear and concise of an answer to that question as possible, tied as closely to business value as you can, is where I would start with any data function. And if it, like, scope is all, like, if you don't have a clear answer, just keep scoping things down and be like, sure, maybe data is too broad. It's like, okay, cool. All we're going to do is build dashboards to inform decision making. That adds value to our business because we inform 10 of the top 20 decisions that are made every quarter. So, like, at least you have a thing you can point to. The minute you try and have too much scope, the answer is like, we just help the data run more efficiently, the company run more efficiently, and no one knows why you exist. So I think taking on less scope, even if it means creating slightly less value, as long as you can point to it and measure it, I think is something that a lot of data teams should be doing.
Yeah. In that, I mean, because, dashboards are always kind of an interesting topic, only in the sense that it's like, all right, we have 8,000 dashboards. Yeah. No way you're looking at 8,000 dashboards, right? Like, looks like the company has 500 people. It's just they all got developed. So how do you actually get to a point where it's like you have, like you said, 5 dashboards or whatever it is that make those 10 or 20 decisions, versus kind of this just constant, expansion of everything?
I think this is probably the biggest problem with data teams, is their ability to set a bar of, this is like how much work we can take on, treating their own time as scarce. So, like, you end up if you look at the last 3 years, compute costs just kept going up, like team sizes just kept going up, and everything just kept going up into the right. And it was one of those, except business value. Like, you don't need 8,000 dashboards. Dashboards 790, 990, like, onwards were useless, like, or incrementally valuable. So I think the first step is just say, given our team size, ignore the team size, given the company, how many things actually matter? If your job is automate workflows, if your job is build dashboards, or your job is build data products, how many of those legitimately will move the needle? Because it's not 8,000 dashboards. So it's like, okay, let's say it's dashboards. You have 10 executives, each exec has 2 goals for the quarter. It's like, great. Maybe you have 10 dashboards with 2 metrics on each of them. You can at least inform your leadership of the current state of each of their bets. Is it really worth trying to build dashboards or self-serve analytics for every people manager below that? And now you're going from 10 people with 2 metrics to like an order of magnitude more, like probably not worth your time. So it's really picking a scope of problem that is worth it. So if you're an analytics team, pick the types of decisions you want to be focused on solving, and then draw a line in the sand and say, we are only going to manage 20 KPIs. That is it. And if someone comes along and they're like, oh, I really need you to add the 21st KPI, instead of just saying no, just say, that's perfect, amazing. Which one of the other 20 should we get rid of? Because if you can get rid of one of those, we can get rid of the transform, like the models that are actually querying data. You can get rid of the compute that's running in the background, spinning cycles, and you can get rid of the ingestion connectors that are costing you money to move that data. So it's like, if you draw a line in the sand of how many metrics or data assets that your team is willing to maintain, given the resourcing, and given the needs of the company, it forces people to prioritize, and it forces a conversation about what is absolutely critical. And I think most companies just keep assuming they can continue adding more and more stuff. And the minute you do that, like, you'll somehow get to 8,000 dashboards, and you can't point to the value created by most of them.
Yeah, I think what I like about that point is like it also pushes into the how do you get your data team to be part of strategy and not just, delivering dashboards. It's like, yeah, that's fine, but you're acknowledging the fact that like, hey, there's humans on the other side of this number that are looking at this number. And in theory, if you're thinking about it correctly, they need to make a decision off of it. And there's only so many decisions that they can make in a quarter, in a short period of time, that the company can actually even like respond to, right? Like, it's like, okay, we want to increase marketing budget. That has consequences, right? Like, there's only so many marketing people. Now we have to figure out what to do with this extra budget. So yeah, I think what I like about that is that also forces, again, like you said, leadership to actually be like, okay, what are we actually doing with these numbers? And why are we changing them? So I think I do like that.
The other side of that too is not just like, what are we doing with these numbers, but it's also like, what are we not doing? Every one of the dashboard, like if you have 8,000 dashboards, there's probably 10 that are valuable, and there's thousands that are not. And the 10 that are valuable are important, but the other 7,990 distract from the 10. Like, if you have those other ones, they are a liability for the company because it's unclear where the valuable information is inside your business. So like, if you think about most company strategy docs are, I used to do strategy at LiveRamp after data. Company strategy docs are not multi-pronged, like 50 different things, step-by-step project management Gantt charts. It's like very, very concise. Our goal for the next quarter to 6 months is this. Based on that, for the next 6 to 12 months, we'll be able to take that as building blocks and move on to the next stage of our strategy. From there, we'll go into step 3. The minute you add like 20 other ifs, ands, else clauses, and you add complexity, people's eyes gloss over and it's done. No one actually listens to what you're saying. And I think most data teams don't understand the same exact thing happens when you just keep adding more and more dashboards. I think most people think about things like self-service analytics, or think about data catalogs, or think about discovery of data assets as a solution to that problem. But it's like, in reality, you just have to communicate to the company, what are the top 10 things? And a big part of that is not having the other 1,000. Like, it's your job to delete them. And like, sure, people, like, I see one of the comments right now, it's like, people's feelings will get hurt by that. It's like, yes, like, but if they disagree that it's not a high value thing, they should fight for it. Like, they should be the one saying this is actually a top 20 goal for the company. And if someone shuts them down, like, at least they know. And I think most people don't want to have those conversations as the data team. They just keep saying yes indefinitely, which I think is really bad for companies.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone over your experience setting up a sort of centralized, but with like a hub and spoke kind of approach. team model at LiveRamp. Kind of talked a little bit about prioritizing with teams. And he brought up self-service a few times, and I wanted to I was like poking at that because, I guess we can start with like, where do you feel like the term kind of comes from? I guess like why does it even exist?
I think most people, maybe this is wrong. I think most people think about self-service analytics as Excel spreadsheets are bad or Google Sheets are bad. Why is everyone not using my data infrastructure instead? And they're like, if I can just make it so everyone can write SQL or everyone can use a drag and drop wizard, they'll never need a spreadsheet ever again, which is absolutely insane. And spreadsheets are phenomenal at what they're great at. And if you think about what most people think self-service analytics accomplishes, it's ad hoc stuff. Spreadsheets are unbelievably good at ad hoc stuff because you can just take some data, put it in a spreadsheet, do an ad hoc analysis, be like, oh, this is useful, this is not useful, make a quick decision, and just delete the spreadsheet when you are done, or archive it and forget about it indefinitely. And I think what people, at least in spreadsheet land, people are able to say goodbye. They're able to let go of the spreadsheet and it disappears and no one ever comes back and says, oh, that spreadsheet you sent me from 6 months ago, it's out of date. Like, that's on you. In the self-service analytics world, you're effectively empowering people to do all these random things. And at any moment ever, someone can come back and say, oh, remember that thing you did 9 months ago? Like, there's a problem with it. And data teams take it personally. They don't take it as if like ad hoc analysis is ad hoc. So I think most people, I think there's some middle ground between like, how do you make more raw data accessible for people to do their own ad hoc analysis, kind of like the fast cycle approach as opposed to the slow cycle approach. But I think a lot of people are trying to do it just because they don't want to deal with the problems themselves. They're just punting it to other people and being like, someone else will prioritize what's valuable and what's not. And I think that's the data team not doing the data team's job.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think. In terms of, I think spreadsheets is a good point. I think I remember hearing someone say something about that with like DBT, where it's like, yeah, we tried to make things more accessible to everyone, and we just forced everyone to have to learn SQL. Which, yeah, like arguably spreadsheets is in terms of like lower barrier to entry but high ceiling, right? Like, it's like, you can get pretty crazy with spreadsheets. Like, it's great. Like, most people honestly just want a pivot table and that's it. And honestly, I've actually heard that a few times where someone's like, oh yeah, it's like I've got like a Tableau or a Sigma dashboard and it's basically just a pivot table, right? Like, it's like, That's all they wanted. That's all. Like, we just want those numbers. I also like the whole point of like, yeah, maybe 9 months from now, someone can get upset because maybe it's still alive somewhere. It hasn't, like, it should have died at that analysis, but now someone's pointing out that it's wrong, which is interesting. I guess, do you feel like someone once put out there that's like self-service, like no one wants self-service analytics, was a comment I got, which I thought was interesting, but it's just what's forced to happen because whatever reason. What do you think forces companies to kind of need self-service analytics?
I think most data teams that implement, I think most of them just absolutely fail. Self-service analytics plays absolutely fail. And I think the reason why they started is not because the company said, give me self-service analytics. Like, what the company probably said is, give me data in a spreadsheet. And the data team said, no, just use this instead. And I think in most scenarios, self-service analytics projects start because the data team doesn't want to have to deal with prioritizing work. And they're getting all these requests that come in and they want to say yes to them all because they can't figure out what's high value and what's low value. So they say, I'm not going to deal with this problem. I don't want to deal, I don't want to deal with priorities. I don't want to deal with business value. I don't want to deal with stakeholders. Can I put myself behind some sort of interface that lets other people deal with this problem instead of me? And they think self-service analytics solves that problem. So they expose something, but now whose job is it to actually prioritize what's valuable and what's not? What you've effectively done is like, you've created your own platform team and decentralized analysts without any communication between the two. And either your data team also, like, self-service analytics implies someone else is doing this on their own. Whereas in most scenarios, like it's probably an analyst. If they're using Looker, like it's someone that actually knows how to use Looker. Like every single person inside the company should not be building their own Looker dashboards. Like most of it's just ad hoc questions. It's not like most self-service analytics projects don't need to be automated. They don't need to be up to date. They need to be one-time questions that you get answers to. There's not a ton of benefit of doing that through data infrastructure, except scale. Like if you're trying to smash 2 billion rows of data together, you need something bigger than a spreadsheet. But beyond that, like there's not a ton of benefit of piping stuff through data infrastructure as opposed to just putting it inside of a spreadsheet, in my opinion. And most data teams are just trying to get away from having to deal with business stakeholders.
And then do you feel like, I guess in that case, like, do you kind of alleviate some of that when you have analysts decentralized? Like, do you think there are ways to like, or do data teams just need to like go out and talk to stakeholders more?
I think it depends on the team structure and what people are excited about doing. Like if inside of a small company, some of the best data teams I've seen are a individual who can stand up infrastructure, like put puzzle pieces together, like ELT, EL, some dashboards, whatever. They're like, okay, cool, I have that. And then they go talk to people in the business. They're like, what is absolutely the most important thing? And then they build it. And they say no to a lot of stuff. Like the best data teams say no to a lot of stuff. Bigger companies, it's either a centralized team who's like truly ingrained in different parts of the business. And if someone says, I really need this, they say, I hear you, but we actually have something higher value from this other business unit. Do you agree or disagree? Because we need to know which one's higher priority because we're only going to say yes to one. So like centralized teams need to be able to say no to a lot of stuff. If you decentralize it, what you're effectively doing is you are allocating resources to business units before you know the problems they have. So it's more of the benefit of decentralization is it's like you've allocated 2 marketing analysts, 1 finance analyst, and 1 product analyst. So for the next year, marketing's gonna have twice the budget of finance and product from a resourcing perspective on the data team. So you don't have to like figure that out month by month over the course of the year. So it benefits you because you like make that decision once and then you run with it for a quarter or a year, which means you don't have to think about it nonstop. If you don't decentralize, you're constantly going to be arguing back and forth between the CMO and the CPO and the CFO. And if you neglect someone for too long, they will stand up their own analyst. So it's like, I think the benefit of decentralization is there is a formal process by which analyst resources are allocated to teams. And as long as it generally aligns with what they need, they don't have the need to go just spin up their own thing if you neglect them. But yeah. I think that the benefit, so that's why I think for bigger companies, having a formal process around allocating analyst resources makes a lot of sense. But you still have to have them all talk to each other. Otherwise, they'll duplicate efforts.
How do you like just have? Have you kind of structured that? Do they just have meetings? Do they?
I think this way
analyst anonymous meetings.
I think the common thing there is like scope everything down as much as possible. The number of dashboards, the number of everything should just shrink because then everyone can actually understand what's going on inside this business and the things that are correct, like the things that are actually important to the business, people can find. So like shrink things, like don't have 8,000 dashboards because no one will, even if you talk every week, no one will know what's going on. Number 2, just meetings. Like at LiveRamp, the first thing I did was set up weekly meetings with all the data people, even if we didn't actually interface on anything. It was just like, okay, cool. Marketing is trying to figure out how to reduce churn. Like product is trying to figure out how to drive usage. Like you could at least hear what was top of mind for everyone. So yeah, I think the biggest thing is like the platform team or whoever it is that's working on centralized data infrastructure needs feedback from everyone else of what's important. Analysts need feedback and a place to give feedback to the platform team, and they need to be talking to business stakeholders directly. And they have to be talking to each other to make sure they're not duplicating efforts. So like those are the 3 main interfaces between analysts, whether they're centralized or decentralized, a centralized platform team, and the business. Most of the time you have a head of data whose job is to make sure all of that stuff runs smoothly and make sure that those conversations are all happening.
You actually answered the next question, which was like, hey, is there someone who's managing all of this, all these conversations? Because yeah, I imagine there's someone who needs to report out, okay, what's actually going on to someone like, again, the CEO or something, so that they know like, okay, projects are going forward.
Yeah.
Versus maybe having, the CMO report to it, the COO, and everyone just kind of give quick updates. So that makes sense. Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting question. So I'm just gonna pop this one up. But so do you feel like there's a good ratio of stakeholders versus data analysts and engineers overall?
So this is an interesting question, because I've seen kind of both examples. I've seen people say, "Oh, we have the perfect ratio of X to Y," and it's like, but if you don't know what you're doing, like, what's the point of having like 3 out of 100 people working on data? Like, if you can't point to the business value created, what's the point? I also think it depends on the scope. So if you think about it, it's like, if your data team's only job is build external facing data products, like you don't build internal dashboards and you don't automate workflows, it directly needs to correlate to the revenue coming in. Like, if you're bringing in 50% of your revenue from a product built on dashboards powered by your data team, staff up, because it makes a lot of sense. If your data team has scope of just building dashboards, like, again, like, do you really need more than 10? If that's the case, do you really need a team of 20 people, like each managing a half of a dashboard? Probably not. But like, the bigger data teams I've seen are the ones that are able to keep succeeding at whatever scope they start with. Maybe it's dashboards for the CMO, and then it becomes dashboards for the leadership team. Then it becomes, hey, actually, we're also going to take on operations. So like, what you'll actually see is data teams that are both building dashboards to inform decisions and also automating workflows. So like, anytime someone's like, hey, we need to connect our CRM system to our ERP system, the data team takes that scope on. If that scope is high leverage to the business, the data team can double. And so it really depends on how much leverage the data team is creating. I would say the easiest way for me to think about this problem is, if you hire the next person, how much is it going to cost? Or person plus whatever technology you're asking for, how much is that going to cost? And what is the next project that your data team is able to take on that is going to create 2, 3, 4 times as much value as that? Because if you, at some point, that math's not going to work. At some point, you're going to say, I want to hire another person, but I can't point you to another $1 million in value that someone else in the business will literally give me budget for. That's the cleanest way to figure out the next hire. The problem is, as businesses change and the macro environment changes, you might have hired the perfect team up until now, but if the company just got cut in half from a revenue perspective, like, the ROI of the data team can go down as well. So I think it depends. I think it's a tough question.
Yeah, no, it's a good way of at least looking at it, like not necessarily some golden ratio per se, but again, like, really trying to look at it from like, well, what is this actually adding to our company? Going back to the, like, if you've already got your 20 KPIs that are managed, like, is there something else that you need right now? Which then, so I think this was a question I had earlier. Like, so if there are other functions that need to occur, like automation and, maybe building a product dashboard, right? Like, that's going and being embedded in your solution. Do you see like that's something else that you hire for? Like, those are just specific because, like, okay, we're going to hire now a team that does, automation work. We're going to hire a team that does like product work, or how do you view those components?
Those typically I would actually associate with different people. So like, sure, I would hire someone whose job is automation, or like, I would, at some point in the company's life cycle, I would have someone whose job is prioritize all the workflows that can save the company time and money. Does that person sit alongside of a head of analytics? Maybe, depending on your team structure. If you have a COO and you have a head of analytics over here and you have a head of automation next to them, like, that might work for your team. Depends on people's expertise. In another company, it might be you have a head of data with a analytics man, like someone who's in charge of analytics and someone who's in charge of automation. The problem is, just like a company, like if you're a small company and you have 10 different product lines, you're going to spend your time trying to just manage all the product lines and figure out what's going on and which ones to prioritize, as opposed to like being really great at product number one. So I think taking on new, different scope is a really big mental lift for people to do. And the minute you give someone more than 1, maybe 2, like KPIs to manage against, it becomes really difficult for them to do a great job at their business, at their job. So like CROs, like, it's revenue, like stuff like that. So I would think about, like, what is the key metric for the leader, and then what are the key metrics for each people? I would just try and keep them as clean as possible, as opposed to throwing 10 different responsibilities onto one person.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just thinking about like what people should care about. I think, you brought up the fact that, when you worked, especially at LiveRamp, like you had the ability to talk to a lot of people who had a lot of different incentives, and, whether it was CRO, probably CMO, et cetera. Like, what do you kind of glean from that in terms of like, what would be useful for data teams to understand about some of these roles that maybe they don't, right? Because like sometimes they're so focused on building infrastructure, they don't realize that, well, you're building it for whatever you're building is for someone that has incentives. Again, maybe it's tied to a specific number. Like, what should they be kind of understanding about people on that side?
There's like the transactional stuff, like, ooh, marketers care about this and CROs care about this. I think where most people get stuck is they don't realize that your CRO and your CMO and your VP of operations and whoever, they're all human beings that don't just want to care about, like, don't just want to talk about whatever next dashboard you want to build for them. Because like, if you think about it and someone comes up to you and they're like, hey Ben, like I really want to help you with this. Can we talk? It's like, they want to like just chat with you every 3 months and like actually build a relationship and a friendship with you before they actually like spill the beans on everything going on inside of their life, because they have other people that they trust more than you. So I think there's a funny anecdote. Like when I was at LiveRamp, I spent a lot of time on just like culture. It wasn't part of my job description, but I like would put on events in the office. I would like help with the holiday parties. I would like walk around the office with a beer cart. Like on random days throughout the week, I would fill up a cart full of beer and I would walk the halls in the office. And you look at that and be like, that's insane. Like, why are you doing this? Like that's not your job. That doesn't help in any way. What that allowed me to do was I would go up to someone and be like, hey, do you want a drink? Like, didn't matter if it had alcohol or not. Like, do you want me to grab you something from the fridge? And it would start a conversation with all these people that in the moment, I didn't need to have those conversations. There was no immediate benefit to me or them to having it. But I would do this probably every 2 weeks. And then funny enough, like whenever I would need insight into what are the top priorities for sales reps, what are the top, like, how do we think about churn? I could go back to someone who I had just brought a Diet Coke to 2 weeks ago and had a friendly conversation and be like, hey, like any chance I could just pick your brain on something that's going on? And it gives you a reason, like it gives these people some level of trust with you. I think most data teams view business stakeholders as this like transactional set of people that like, I'm going to go talk to the CRO and pitch them on like, and get the perfect KPIs from them. When in reality, it's like any other relationship. Like you have to actually like just become friends and build trust with them before they're actually going to like be like, oh yeah, can you help me with this? Like, I want to talk to you. Like if they don't want to spend time talking to you, it's going to be really painful to figure out what's high value for them.
Yeah. It almost sounds a little bit like being a salesperson, like, only in the sense that, right, like sometimes it's just about like the constant touches, constantly trying to be helpful until there is a clear need from you or from them, where they're like, oh yeah, this person seems knowledgeable in this space, and they can be helpful. Also, that explains your low-key happy hours.
Yes. So like sales, like data teams can't ignore the importance of marketing and sales. Like everyone inside of your company, like send a monthly or weekly email out to the entire company. Ignore data. Just send something that's valuable to the business. Like come up with the things that are really important to the CMO or the CEO or the leadership team. Be like, if I were to just summarize all this stuff and email it to everyone, they would be happy about it. Like add value to them over and over again. And then at some point, if you want to pick their brain on something, at least they know who you are. Like if you just try and hard sell someone on anything, whether it's like a new product or service or a dashboard, they're gonna be like, who is this person? Like, why are you trying to talk to me? I don't know who you are. I don't trust you. But if you've spent the time to build a relationship with no point whatsoever, like the low-key happy hours, there is no point whatsoever for those happy hours, except like to me, I actually find it to be a phenomenal place to like build a community and just get to know people. But like when I reach out and I'm like, hey, can I just like pick your brain on what we're thinking for the next iteration of Portable? People are like, yeah, more than happy to. Like, let's grab coffee. So it's like, I would think about internal stakeholders and business stakeholders at businesses the exact same way. Like build a relationship, like market your data team, market yourself to the business, have meetings with these people on a regular basis, and use that as a way of identifying the high value stuff. You can't just jump to, oh, here's the high value stuff if you haven't done the upfront work to build the relationships.
Yeah, I think this also resonates with something that Tom, who was on last week's live, kind of talked about, where it's like, he's like, yeah, you have to spend some time evangelizing, especially if you're like the first data hire. Like, because no one, like everyone can kind of do, like, in a lot of companies, people can operate to a degree without you, right? Like, it's like, look, they'll make it work. Like, they don't 100% need you to a degree. Like, you need to show what you can add, like the fact that you can solve some of these problems either better or faster or more efficiently or more repeatably, whatever it is, but to start with, they probably already have a method that works, right? Like, they already have a way they're getting this data somehow. Maybe it's not great, but they're doing it and it works and they know and they trust it. And so, yeah, that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Raise your visibility without selling. That's funny. I was just reading a comment from Ramono.
Yep.
I think there's at least one question, and we can kind of go from there. But I wish this was a little more specific. But maybe you'll understand that if you don't, I'm not fully getting where it's going. So, how do you tackle the data complexity challenge? So, I don't know if that's more of a person like maybe.
I would. So I don't exactly. So the way I would interpret this question is, if you look at a company, if you drop me into any company and you were like, look at the data, I'd be like, this is an absolute nightmare. Like, what are all these databases? What are all these applications? What is all like pipelines? Data is stored, it's moved, it's all this, it's chaos. It's absolute chaos inside of every company. I think the way I would tackle this is like, ignore it. Ignore the data complexity and just focus on what are the use cases that matter to your business. I was talking to someone recently and they were effectively being like, hey, like my ELT bill just jumped from $200 a month on a different vendor, not us, to $5,000 in a week. And it's one of those things of, you can look at that through the lens of like, okay, how do we think about this? It's a Postgres database. There's 50,000 different tables. How are they being transformed? Where are the costs coming from? All of that. But if you just ignore it all and you ignore the data complexity, you say, before we jump into that, like $200 for $5,000, great, we'll come back to that. Why are you moving this data at all? Like, what is the goal? Like, why are you paying the $200? Like, let alone the $5,000? Like, what is the business use case you're trying to power here? If you don't have an answer to that, none of the complexity matters and you should shut it all off. So I think the biggest question is, the minute you see complexity, take 2 steps back and just be like, what is the MVP answer to a question, or MVP workflow automation we can power here? And delete every other query or pipeline or transformation along the way. And you'll find that a lot of the complexity just disappears, because you can safely ignore 99% of the data. It's just not useful.
Yeah. That's actually a conversation we had recently. Not the cost thing. I was like, there are certain people that it's getting very pricey for. So yeah. Next question is on data product managers. Actually, at some point in the conversation, I was like, oh, that kind of sounds like a, whatever you can call it, DPM, I guess. Do you have any hot takes on this role?
I don't think they should exist. So I think there are very few scenarios in which a data team is big enough where you should literally be thinking about like data plus a product manager plus anything else. The only scenario in which I could see justifying a title like data, first of all, I don't know what this title means. So I think it's a stupid article. I want to talk to whoever read it, HBR. But the other side of it's like, if you're building a product and the product just happens to be using data and it's an external facing product, I don't know why you need to call it data product manager. I would just call it product manager, because you're building an external product. You just happen to be using data. If you're a data team, I think a lot of the titles we've seen in the last 3 years are going to disappear. I think teams are shrinking. They're getting cut in half, if not cut by 2/3. And everyone can't have their own title anymore. I think people need to let go of the fact that they can say no to other data projects and just take on more scope. And I think having a data product manager implies you then have a data team that does the actual work, and they're like, we can't justify that many stakeholders anymore. I think people have to be more generalists than they were 2 years ago.
Are there any specific roles you're pointing at there, or just in general?
I have a lot of hot takes on data science. I think most companies should not have data scientists at all. I think some companies should have lots of data scientists. I think most companies should not have any data scientists. I think the titles of, like, most companies, when they have lots of people, will have like a head of data, a head of data engineering, a head of data science, a head of data analysts, or like head of analysts. I don't know what the actual title is. They're like analytics manager. Like, then they'll have like analytics engineers, and then they'll have teams underneath those, which is like absolutely insane because that's so many people. But I think the roles of data engineer, analytics engineer, analyst, are all going to be collapsing. Because like if you went from having a 4-person team where it's head of data, data engineer, analytics engineer, analyst, to now, which is the reality is that team's probably 1, maybe 2 people. Like you can't just be the data engineer anymore. You have to be one of 2 data people that will just help the company. And I think very few companies should justify titles that are more than just like, I'm data person number 1 and you're data person number 2. Let's just add value to this business and go from there.
All right. Well, we'll put that on the next job description: data person 1, data person 2. I think this is a good question too. Any tips on how to communicate the value of like automating like a pipeline? He says complex, but a pipeline versus essentially a dashboard is kind of how I read this, because I think this is usually an interesting conversation. I had a conversation with someone where they literally were like, "Oh, it's far easier for me to hire like a data scientist or a data analyst than it is to hire a data engineer." And I think it's kind of a similar aspect here, where one is like very easy, like you develop something that is tangible. The other is not. Do you have any tips there?
I think my guess here is the people that are able to explain the power of self-service dashboards and analytics in general are people that have the scope of our job is build dashboards and inform decisions. They're probably quite familiar with how do you quantify the value of impacting a $10 million paid advertising budget. It's like, but they're not as familiar thinking about automating a pipeline. If the pipeline is part of an analytics project, like you're moving data to then power a dashboard, it's part of a dashboard. So like quantify the impact of the dashboard, and then the rest of your company should not care about how you actually accomplish that goal. It does not matter to them. If the goal is automate a workflow, like when this happens inside of our CRM system, send an email over here. The easiest way to do it, in a lot of scenarios, it can undervalue things, is like find the alternative. Like how many hours a week was this taking someone manually? How much do they get paid ballpark? How many hours did you save them? That's how, like most automation projects, the easiest way to quantify them is how many hours were saved and how much does that time cost. It's not always that simple, but that's typically the math I use for anything related to operations and automation.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be complex.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we can summarize this about data quality, but how do you tackle kind of data quality challenges in terms of optimizing? I think we can just generalize that. How do you optimize for data quality? Because I don't know what's teams. The
easiest answer to this one is fewer data assets and smaller teams. I think the answer is not more tools, more assets, and bigger teams, because like that just makes all of this stuff more complicated. So it's like shrink it all down so that the stuff that you do well is number one. And then the last part is like you could think about all the interfaces between like your 6 data people or like your 6 data people and all the stakeholders. I think the biggest way to address data quality challenges is a shared vision. Like every business stakeholder and everyone on the data team understands the point. What is the goal? Is everyone on the same page? Are we rowing the same boat together? If you start pointing at tools, like I just talked to someone and they were like, our biggest problem right now is data quality. Like no one trusts us. Everything just blew up. I was like, oh, like, have you thought about a data quality tool? Which is, it's a, not the right answer, but like, I was like, have you thought about a data quality tool? They're like, oh yeah, we already use one. And it's like, oh, well, they're now at war with stakeholders and they're pointing to a tool that was supposed to work, but it didn't. When in reality, it's like, if everyone's on the same page about what the point of the project is, and that everyone is truly on board, trusting each other, that everyone's working in the best interest of that project, you'll figure out all the tiny pieces along the way. But I think if you don't set a joint vision that everyone is super excited about, you'll keep arguing over data quality the entire time.
Yeah. I think I like the biggest thing I think I take away from me is like, like doing less, I think makes a lot of sense, because oftentimes, especially a lot of data quality tools, some of them can kind of predict or catch some issues like after they occur, but they really are just like this giant broad thing, right? That like maybe they'll catch these issues, but that's kind of what they're limited to, right? Like if you didn't build the thing well enough or something, the data quality tool is useful if like the data coming in is bad, but if the system is bad, like that's a different thing. And if the system is bad because you had too many goals, that makes sense. Do you have any tips for people who maybe are doing too many things and how to feel comfortable doing less? Because I think that's something that's like sometimes it's just like a confidence issue. You feel like you need to put out dashboard because you need to define the fact that you're valuable.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a really interesting question because I come across a lot of people that are tend to be more junior in the data world, where when I say like go just delete 80% of the dashboards, they're like, that's absolutely insane. I will get fired for that. And it's like, if you position it incorrectly, I could see that. So like, but I think it's a question of, I think the easiest way is whenever people ask you for stuff, don't just say no. Just have a list of here what you think are the top 20 things going on in the business and say, is it more valuable than one of these 20 or one of these 30 or one of these 8,000? If you want to draw the line at 8,000 dashboards, at least you're drawing a line. So like pick the top 8,000 and be like, okay, great. Here's the 8,000 dashboards we're going to maintain. Stupid, yes. But at least you have a line. And then be like, okay, great. You want number 8,001? Tell me which one of these 8,000 to delete. And then delete it. So like, but I think forcing people, like showing people that your time is scarce and showing them the other 20 things you're trying to prioritize, let them help you. Let them actually be the one to tell you, oh, that other marketing project that you think is a top 20, I actually am the one that asked you for that. And it's actually not useful anymore. Like you can delete that. So I think just putting people on the same side of the table as you and saying, hey, I can't take on an infinite amount of work. I can only take on 20 things, 10 things, whatever. Can you help me figure out where to slot this in and what else I can remove, either from requests you've made or other people have made? You'll be shocked at how much people will actually help you.
I think the one interesting response I can envision someone having is like, oh yeah, I can't take on more work, would be like, oh, should we hire someone else? Like, what would your response be there? Because like, yeah, what if they're like, yeah, we'll hire 2 more people, then you can do this work, right?
I would. So like there's pros and cons of that. The biggest thing is like, who's asking to hire this? If it's like, if the CMO is saying, okay, great, here are the highest priority things, and instead of me as the CMO hire, and I want the data team to hire, if it's in everyone's best interest for that to happen, and you know those projects aren't just 3-month long projects, because the other thing there is if you hire to take on work for the CMO and then a year later you can't justify that headcount, it is on you. It is a problem for you. So like before any sort of hiring decision, I would just do a little more research to still see if there's other stuff you can delete, because I would still just keep saying no to more stuff. But having people say, yes, I believe that if you do this project for me and you keep doing it for the next 2 years, I can justify effectively taking money out of my budget and putting it into yours, is one of the best justifications for hiring. Because if you don't hire, the marketing person will. But I still, before doing any of that, I would say, can we do this in a leaner way? Because no one wants bloat for the sake of bloat. And I think most people can 10x their efficiency on their data team by just saying no to more stuff.
Do you, I mean, I don't want to keep you too long. It's already 1. So maybe we wrap up
Right,
with one
yeah.
question. Yeah. So the bloat for more bloat's sake, do you think that's true? Like, do you think it's not like, because I feel like sometimes, writing on your resume, I managed a team of 30 people sounds, at least, to some people, probably more impressive than like I managed a team of 5 people. Obviously you should be results focused and talking about that, talk about what you did with 5 people, but like, I do feel like some people have a desire to manage more for the sake of more.
Oh, I think a lot of people do. And I think a lot of people have over the last few years. And I think it's a massive liability on your resume to have that. Not in every scenario. In a lot of respects, there are teams that should be 30 people in the data world. It is a very, very small number of companies that should have a 30-person data team. So what you're effectively doing every time you hire more and more people is you're qualifying yourself for fewer and fewer, probably higher paying jobs. But if you think about it, the number of people over the last 3 years that have managed a 10-person data team is probably 5x. Like everyone's grown their data team to 10 people. The number of people that right now should have a 10-person data team is quite small. So all those people that have now managed a 10-person data team are either looking at a much, much smaller pool of jobs competing for them with all these other people, or they're going to smaller data teams. And I think any hiring manager in the data world or anyone hiring a data person should be asking the question of like, okay, cool, you manage a 10-person data team. Why? Like why did you need 10 people to do that work? So I think if I was hiring anyone in the data world, even if I knew nothing else about data, and on their resume it showed that they managed 2, 5, 10, 20 data people, the bigger that number gets, you better have a very, very, very buttoned up answer as to why you're about to spend. Let's say you have a 10-person data team at $200,000 all in between salary, benefits, and tech. Like, you're talking millions of dollars that you're spending as a data team.
Yeah.
In a lot of companies, data is a cost center. If the next hiring manager doesn't say, why did you absolutely need a 10-person data team? That's on, like, it can be a massive liability for you. So I would very much stay away from hiring, and I would think about justifying the value of your data team, not as how many people was I able to manage, because like anyone could be like, why did you need 10 people? Why did you need 20 people? That's an absolute absurd amount of, like, if you couldn't get the same amount of work done with 3 people, what were you doing? Why did you need so many people? So it's like, I think it's very easy to cut through that as a hiring manager by just asking the questions of, did you really need that many people? I think the better answer is, I was able to do this with 2 people. Or like, sure, we had 10 people, but we were powering a product that truly generated $50 million in revenue. And here I can point you to the customers that were happy with the embedded dashboards we built for them. So like, I think it's an ROI question, not a AUM question. Like the assets under management of how many people you managed isn't what matters in data. Like, data teams should not be like revenue teams where your job is keep staffing. Like, revenue CROs, if you manage more and more people, like, you assume each salesperson, each SDR can bring in so many deals, each account exec can close so many deals. Like, it ties directly with how much money you're booking like the new sales that are coming in every day. Data teams, like, unless you can point to like every incremental hire, we were driving an extra $1 million in revenue for the business, which is almost impossible to do. I would very, very much stay away from managing a really big data team, because the minute people start asking questions, you have to justify why you have that 10-person data team. Otherwise, it's gonna be tough to explain how that's not going to happen the next time.
Yeah, because it would argue that it's like, well, are you resource efficient? Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Ethan, for joining us. I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate your time. Yeah. No, this was fun. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. So thank you everyone who was on. LinkedIn was being a little bit on the fritz, but other than that, I don't know, Ethan, any final words from you?
Nothing else going on. One more question down here on the bottom. What data pipeline tool would you recommend for an organization considering scalability in the future? Check out portable.io. It's the ELT tool that I run. We focus on all the connectors that you can't find anywhere else. But no, honestly, thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. And if anyone has questions or wants to just chat about data, ping me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to grab some time. Love talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm going to hit end stream here.